to make in the forward to Mike's book is that, you know, visually you can see that Mike is considerably older than I am. Yeah. We are basically in the same generation, and the great thing, the glorious, delightful, delicious thing about being a young reader in that generation is that we didn't know anything. There was no community. Obviously there was no internet. There were no groups like this that I recall, certainly not where I lived. There was no method of ever knowing anything about books. So really every single author was undiscovered and forgotten for every individual reader. Everything was a lucky discovery. And the two that I was most delighted with, I absolutely, the first one I bought in an import record shop in Birmingham. It was 1969 when, you know, you could buy cannabis pipes and imported records and this and that. A head shop, in other words, it was called. And they had a rack of incredibly lurid American paperbacks. And I saw this great one called The Damned and the Destroyed by Kenneth Orvis. And it had the most lurid cover, purpley cover, with these scantily clad people clearly involved in a drug-fueled orgy. And there was a strapline under the title saying, "She was young, she was a junkie, I had to help her." So I bought the book, and it turned out to be a Canadian set in Montreal, a very solid thriller that was a really fine piece of work. And I loved the book. I also loved the chance discovery. And then the other one that I remember similar, and I've got no idea whether this is forgotten or whether it was huge at the time, but to me it was unknown. That's my point. Every single book was unknown to every single reader. It was called Daddy by Loup Durand, who was probably French, so he probably doesn't, the Canadian guy and the French guy doesn't qualify for Mike's book. But that was a spectacular chase thriller set during World War II. A young boy who was some kind of a savant had the account number of his father's Swiss bank account in his head. The Nazis wanted the money. He was fleeing from them. He had a strange bunch of Spanish renegades acting as his bodyguard. It was just a spectacular book. Made all the better for the fact that I didn't know anything about it. There was no hype, no advertising, no promotion, no nothing. It was just a random discovery, which made it all the more delightful. And in a lot of ways, I love the fact that we have communities like this now, and we have a lot of exchange of information on the internet. Generally speaking, that's really good, and it's really helpful, and it's great. But it does rob us of the chance of making those random chance discoveries that seemed all the more delightful for the fact that it felt like yours alone. You know, you're the only person that knew this book. And that feeling has gone away a little bit.
It's been serendipity, I guess. That it really helped the book work for you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, guys. So we're starting off in the 1950s, which I think the phrase you use in your book, Mike, is it's the decade when Britain had to come to terms with being ordered. But I wonder if you have ideas about why British thrillers took off in this period. What was it that people wanted? Why did thrillers fill the gap?
I think as I see it, somewhere around about 1952ish, there was definite. I mean, it's not that the crime novel or the detective novel ended. It didn't. It went on, but there was a definite drop. There was a drop in energy. I think there was a drop in readership. There were a few still interesting people like John Bingham, who was John McCarry's boss at MI5, and he wrote interesting stuff. But the innovative, I think, crime novels were coming from America, and big sellers like Mickey Spillane, violent, but also Raymond Chandler, David Goodis, all the noir people. And in Britain, the thriller writer looked at something a bit different, and you had a bunch of guys, I'm afraid they were mostly guys, who had army, military experience, had been abroad, and I think those two things are very important, because they certainly can tell stories where people, young teenagers who hadn't been abroad and would love to go, but fortunately we're not going to have to go abroad to fight, where there's a form of escapism, and they put that knowledge into the thriller. And one of the great appeals of Ian Fleming and James Bond were the foreign locations. There's only one James Bond book set in England. I mean, just trying to think how many Alistair MacLeans are set in England. Maybe 2, maybe 3. I don't know. And he wrote a lot more than Ian Fleming did. Hammond Innes, I can't think of one. That's entirely set. So it's the foreign location thing. Somebody asked me yesterday, why did Britain stop writing thrillers like the ones we're talking about? It's both EasyJet and Ryanair came. Or Fred Laker, as it was. But I think that's important. What was the question?
The question was, why were they popular in the 1950s?
Because we were starved of foreign travel, we were starved of excitement, and we wanted Seminole Village.
Yeah, starved of prestige as well. There was a book called The Man Who Saved Britain.
I wonder.
It was an analysis of the appeal of the James Bond books and movies, and what it basically said was that post-World War II, Britain's prestige and power was exhausted. We could no longer send the Navy here or there, but we could send James Bond here or there. And that somehow consoled a certain type of English person who felt bad about the diminished power and prestige of Britain.
Absolutely.
And I think it was very much a compensatory factor like that.
Yeah, I think to say in the book that in the 50s Britain had gone from a #1 world power to like #4, if they were lucky, or 3 or 4 anyway. And the British Empire which had been defended by all the John Buchan guys before the Second World War, was disappearing, was just dissolving in front of the very eyes. And the British sort of just ignored those facts completely and pretended we still had an empire and we still were a world power.
In fact, I made that argument once in another foreword I wrote for Penguin in the US. We're going to do a trilogy, the three Blofeld James Bonds in one volume. And they asked me to write the foreword. And I condensed that argument to a 1,500-word foreword that I thought was really good. And I said, an Englishman of Ian Fleming's type was feeling demoralized by England's reduced position post-war. And I also, along the way, mentioned that he was a privileged man who came from a family of merchant bankers. And what I had not taken into account is that the Fleming estate vets all these things very carefully. And they got back to me and said, we can't publish this because you're wrong, Ian Fleming was Scottish, not English, which is utter invention. He was obviously English, born in Mayfair, he hardly ever went to Scotland. And then they also said the other problem is that actually merchant bankers in Mayfair had a very hard time in the 1930s.
They were down to just the 2 or 3 Bentleys.
So would I mind changing the intro? I said, no, I won't. You can withdraw it. And Penguin US, to their absolute credit, still paid me for it. So I determined my life's goal after that was to sell that essay somewhere else under the title, You Only Get Paid Twice.
Going back to the original question, I was thinking after the war, and certainly my older brother, he was a lot of the military writers. They were talking about. I mean, because my brother was too young to be in the war, he was reading a lot of war books, like good old Geoffrey Jenkins' A Twist of Sand, which is about submarines. It's the most amazing book. I bought it by accident. I meant to get rid of the sand, which I remember loving. And I got it and went, okay, it's submarines. And I thought, I'll have a look. And I just raced through it. Yeah. It's an absolute classic, but it is so atmospheric, and you're just there. But there were a lot of guys who were writing war stuff for people like my brother who weren't part of the war. Yeah. And he adapted up in comics. There were loads of comics with, I just remember, jeeps and guns and Achtung.
War Picture Library.
Absolutely, and that sort of led into the James Bond.
Yeah, I mean the biggest sellers, the paperback sellers, at about the time Casino Royale came out, were things like The Dam Busters.
Oh, absolutely.
By Paul Brickin and Escape to Victory. That's sort of
the Wooden Horse.
Yeah.
All that stuff, yeah. I mean, speaking as a member of that generation, that's all we read. We read all of those books, The Escaping from Cellar Book 3,
Colditz Story,
Colditz, all that stuff. And the first movie I ever saw in the cinema was The Dam Busters. The second movie I ever saw was Reach for the Sky. It was totally dominated by war stuff. And then the fiction was a migration out of that. It was